The text message came in at 11:47 a.m. on a Saturday. I know the exact time because I had just silenced my phone to walk into the courtroom, and I checked it one last time before the doors closed behind me. It was from my mother. It said, "We're not going to make it, sweetheart. Your brother's thing ran long. You know how these things go. Dad says, good luck. We're proud of you." I stood there in the hallway of the Multnomah County Courthouse in a charcoal blazer I had bought specifically for this day, holding my phone, reading that sentence 3 times. Your brother's thing. His thing. His recreational softball league playoff game, which had been scheduled on the same day as my bar exam results ceremony and swearing in for 2 months, ran long. And that was the whole explanation. I put my phone in my pocket and walked through the doors. Let me back up, because the swearing in wasn't the beginning of this story. It was just the moment the story finally became impossible to ignore. I grew up in a house in suburban Columbus, Ohio, where my brother was the sun and I was something in orbit that nobody had bothered to name. That sounds dramatic. I spent years telling myself it was dramatic. My therapist eventually told me that minimizing your own experience to make other people comfortable is its own kind of damage, and I've been working on that. So let me just say it plainly. My brother Kyle was the favorite, and everyone in my family knew it, and nobody ever said it out loud, which somehow made it worse. Kyle is 3 years older than me. He's funny, genuinely funny. The kind of person who makes strangers at a bar feel like old friends within 10 minutes. I don't resent him for that. I actually love my brother. What I resented was the way my parents organized their entire emotional lives around his comfort and trajectory while mine ran on a kind of autopilot of benign neglect. His college applications were a family project. Mine, my mother said, were something she trusted me to handle because I was so capable. His DUI at 23 was a private family difficulty that we did not discuss outside the house. My one speeding ticket at 24 was brought up at Thanksgiving 2 years later as an example of why I needed to slow down in life, literally and figuratively. I went to law school at Lewis and Clark in Portland because I received a merit scholarship and because, frankly, putting 1,500 miles between myself and Columbus felt like something I needed to survive intact. I told my parents this was about the program. It was about the program. It was also about the 1,500 miles. 3 years of law school. I paid my own rent with the scholarship and a part-time job at a legal aid clinic where I helped tenants fight wrongful evictions. I took out exactly enough in loans to cover books and bar prep. I graduated in the top 12% of my class. I passed the bar on my first attempt, which, if you've never sat for the bar exam, is not a thing to be casual about. Oregon's pass rate that year was 61%. The swearing-in ceremony is a formal thing. Judges attend. The State Bar Association hosts it in an actual courtroom. You raise your right hand and you take an oath, and someone photographs you, and it becomes real in a way that 3 years of late nights and case briefs somehow doesn't. I had sent my parents the date in January. I had sent a reminder in March. I had texted my mother the address and parking information 2 weeks before. Your brother's sting ran long. I raised my right hand and repeated the oath with 17 other new attorneys and a judge who had kind eyes and a steady voice. The woman next to me had her mother and her grandmother in the front row. The man on my other side had brought his entire extended family, 8 people, 2 of whom were holding a banner. I had a friend from law school, Cassie, who had come because she'd passed on the same day and we'd agreed to be each other's people if our families couldn't make it. Cassie's family was there too. She squeezed my hand before they called my name. When they called it, she cheered loud enough for everyone. Afterward, there was a small reception in the hallway outside. I stood with a cup of sparkling cider and watched families take pictures, and I thought about something my evidence professor had said once. The facts that are absent from a record are often more telling than the facts that are present. I had been collecting absences for 29 years and calling them something else. Scheduling conflicts. Busy seasons. Things that just came up. I took out my phone. There were 2 more texts from my mother. The second said, "How did it go? Send pictures." The third, sent 20 minutes later, said, Kyle's team won, by the way. He's so happy." I didn't respond. That evening, I drove back to my apartment in Northeast Portland, changed out of my blazer, and sat at my kitchen table with a glass of wine and my laptop. There was an email from a small civil litigation firm downtown that had been tracking my graduation timeline since a clerkship the previous summer. They'd offered me a position as an associate focusing on tenant rights and consumer protection law. I had been sitting on it for 3 weeks, not because I was unsure, but because accepting it made everything final in a way I was still adjusting to. Portland was not Columbus. Portland was not going back. I accepted the offer. Then I did something I had been thinking about for a long time. I opened the Oregon State Bar name change request portal and started filling it out. My mother's maiden name was Calloway. She had given it up when she married my father, which I always thought was a small private loss she never talked about. Her mother, my grandmother, who had died when I was 16, was the person in my life who made me feel like my achievements were something worth witnessing. She had driven 4 hours by herself to attend my high school graduation when my parents had been at Kyle's travel baseball tournament. She had mailed me a card when I got into law school that said, on the inside, in her handwriting, "Eleanor Calloway would have been proud of you. So am I. Don't let them make you small." I became Wren Calloway the following month, not as a declaration, not as a wound, as an inheritance. I told my parents in an email. I kept it factual and warm enough to be civil. I explained the name change. I explained that I was staying in Portland permanently, that I had accepted the associate position, that I needed some distance from the family dynamic to think clearly about what I actually wanted our relationships to look like going forward. I said I was open to honest conversations when they were ready to have them. My mother called within an hour. I let it go to voicemail. She said I was overreacting. She said the ceremony probably wasn't as formal as I'd made it sound. She said Kyle had felt terrible about it, though she did not explain how she knew that, since she was at the game. She said she hoped I wasn't going to let one day ruin our relationship, and that she'd already bought a plane ticket to visit in the fall, and she hoped I would still be willing to show her around Portland. My father sent a text the next morning. "You've always made everything harder than it needs to be." Kyle sent nothing. Not that day, not the week after. I checked. I don't know why I checked. I settled into the job. The firm was small, 9 attorneys with a managing partner named Mr. Adeyegi, who had been doing tenant advocacy work in Portland for 22 years and who on my first day handed me a stack of files and said, "We're going to lose some of these. The ones we lose matter as much as the ones we win. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I liked him immediately. Tenant rights work is not glamorous. It is a lot of unlawful detainer hearings and habitability inspections and conversations with people who are scared and exhausted and don't understand why the system is built the way it is. What I found 8 months into the job was a pattern I hadn't expected to find. We were seeing a cluster of cases, 12 in 6 months, where tenants in properties managed by a regional property management company called Hargrove Residential Group were being evicted using a lease clause that had been quietly updated in mid-2023. The clause, buried in Section 14(b) of the Standard Lease Addendum, created a material breach definition, broad enough that the company could trigger eviction proceedings for infractions as minor as having an unauthorized plant on a balcony. We were seeing it used disproportionately against tenants in buildings that had recently been flagged for potential sale, essentially as a mechanism to clear units before a sale without technically violating the state's tenant protection statutes. I brought it to Mr. Adeyemi in October. He read my memo twice, asked me 4 questions, and said, "Pull every Hargrove file going back 30 months. We found 27 cases. 15 of them involved tenants who had settled or left without legal representation because they didn't know they had a case. The pattern was clean, consistent, and documented. What I had not known, when I started pulling the files, was that Hargrove Residential Group was a subsidiary of a property development holding company based in Columbus, Ohio. What I had also not known was that my father had joined the board of that holding company 14 months earlier. Kyle had mentioned it once in passing, at Christmas 2 years before, as an example of what he called Dad's good nose for opportunity. I had nodded and changed the subject. I found the board member listing on the company's investor page on a Wednesday afternoon. My father's name, middle initial, and everything was in the third row. I sat with it for a long time before I said anything. My conflict disclosure to Mr. Adeyemi took about 15 minutes. He listened without interrupting, then said, "You're off the litigation team for this one. Everything you've already built will attribute appropriately. And Wren, thank you for coming to me directly." He paused and then added, "A lot of people wouldn't have." I thought about that for a while afterward. I called my father that night. We hadn't spoken since the text message in August. He answered on the third ring, which surprised me more than it probably should have. I told him what I could tell him, which was that a firm I worked at had identified a pattern of potentially unlawful eviction practices by a company he had a board relationship with, that a formal complaint to the Oregon Bureau of Labor and Industries and the State Attorney General's office was likely, and that if there was anything on his end that needed addressing proactively, now was the time to address it. There was a silence. Then he said, "Is this about the ceremony?" I said it's about 27 families who lost their housing. Another silence. Then, "You always have to make yourself the hero of every story." I said, "I'm trying to give you time to get ahead of this. That's the opposite of making myself the hero." He said he would talk to his attorney. He hung up. My mother called the next morning. She had clearly been briefed. She said she understood I had concerns, but that my father had worked very hard to be in the position he was in, and that she hoped I understood what it would mean for the family if something came out of this publicly. She said she knew I was still upset about the ceremony, and she wished I could separate these two things because they really weren't related. She said, "We're your parents. We're supposed to come first." I thought about Cassie squeezing my hand in that courtroom. I thought about my grandmother's card, which I had framed and hung in my apartment. I thought about the 15 families in those files who had moved out of their apartments without understanding they had any recourse. I said, "I didn't bring this to you to make things hard. I brought it to you because you still had options. That window closes when the filing goes in." She said she needed to talk to my father. The filing went in 47 days later. I was not the lead on the complaint. I was listed as a contributing attorney with a disclosed conflict of interest and recusal from direct litigation. 2 other attorneys at the firm carried it forward. The Bully investigation moved quietly and with the particular efficiency of a state agency that receives an organized, well-documented complaint with a clear pattern of evidence. Within 5 months, Hargrove Residential Group had received a formal cease and desist, a mandated remediation agreement requiring them to offer reinstatement or compensation to displaced tenants, and a civil penalty. The holding company, under pressure from institutional investors who did not want regulatory exposure on their balance sheets, restructured its board. My father was not publicly named. He resigned before the final report was issued. His attorney handled it. I know this because my mother told me in an email, the tone of which was equal parts grief and accusation. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be clear about that, because the clean version of this story would have me feeling vindicated and righteous and whole. What I felt was something more like the specific exhaustion that comes after a long time of holding yourself very straight. I had done my job. I had told my family what was coming. I had documented my own position honestly. The outcome was not something I built. It was something I refused to look away from. My mother wrote me a letter in January, actual stationery, her handwriting, 3 pages. Most of it was about logistics, about the stress of the situation, about my father's health, about Kyle's new apartment in Columbus. Near the end, in smaller letters, she wrote, "I've thought about Portland a lot. About what we missed. I don't know if we understood what we were missing when we missed it." I read that sentence many times. I noticed what it was and what it was not. It was movement. It was not an apology. It was the first honest thing she had written to me in years, and it arrived only after the cost of honesty had become lower than the cost of silence. I wrote back, I said I was sorry for the difficulty they were facing. I said I'd tried to give them time to handle it differently. I said I was open to real conversations, not the kind where we all agree to act like certain things didn't happen. I signed it with both names, the first name they gave me and the last name I had chosen, and I meant both parts equally. The remediation fund that came out of the settlement provided direct compensation to 18 of the 27 displaced tenants, whose cases met the threshold for documented harm. The firm handled the distribution. I watched from a careful distance, which is the right place to watch from when you have a conflict of interest and also a conscience. The remaining money I received, through my participation in the case documentation before my recusal, was modest by the standards of people who write about windfalls and significant by the standards of someone who had been paying off law school loans on an associate's salary. I put a portion of it toward a security deposit on a house in the Woodstock neighborhood with a back porch I didn't entirely know how to use and a garden that came with the previous owner's half-finished plans. I put another portion toward a scholarship fund they set up through the Oregon Law Foundation for first-generation law students from rural Oregon counties. The students who would have been me 8 years ago sitting in a library in Columbus at midnight filling out applications alone because their parents were at someone else's game. I still talk to my mother, carefully, at a distance that feels honest rather than punishing. My father and I have exchanged 2 emails in 6 months. Kyle sent a message in February that said, "I heard things were rough. Hope you're doing okay." I replied that I was. I didn't ask about the softball season. Here is what I know now that I didn't know standing in a courthouse hallway reading a text message about a recreational softball game. The people who are supposed to show up for you and don't will always have an explanation that makes sense to them. The explanation is not the point. The pattern underneath the explanation is the point, and the pattern, once you see it clearly, is a kind of information. What you do with the information is the only choice that actually belongs to you. The porch faces west. In the evenings, the light comes through the Douglas firs at the edge of the property in long, flat slants. I make coffee too late in the day and sit out there and think about the oath I took. The one about serving justice and doing right by the people who come to me for help. And I think about how I could not have meant it the way I meant it if I hadn't already been the person who sat in that hallway and read that text message and walked through the doors anyway. I walked through the doors. If someone in your life has made a habit of being absent from the moments that mattered most to you, and if you have made a habit of finding reasons to forgive the absence, I want to ask you something. At what point does protecting their comfort become the same thing as abandoning your own story? And when you finally name that trade for what it is, what do you think you'll decide to do next? I still think about that moment in the hallway sometimes, not with anger anymore, more like the way you remember a fever after it breaks. You know it happened, you can describe the temperature, but you're not in it anymore. What I've come to understand about my own story is that the consequences weren't something I engineered. They were something that followed naturally from choices, mine and my family's both. My parents made a choice, many times over many years, about what was worth showing up for. I made a choice, standing in that courthouse hallway reading a text about a softball game, about what I was willing to keep absorbing. My father made a choice when he joined a board without disclosing it to people who might be affected. And the investigation, the restructuring, the civil penalty, none of that was revenge. It was just the weight of accumulated choices finally landing where they belonged. That's not a religious idea. It's not mystical. It's just how things tend to work when you stop intervening on behalf of people who would not do the same for you. What I'm most proud of, looking back, isn't winning anything. It's that I didn't compromise the one thing that was actually mine, my integrity. When I found my father's name in that data set, I had a choice too. I could have quietly flagged it upward and disappeared from the case without saying a word to anyone in my family. Nobody would have known the connection. Instead, I disclosed everything to Mr. Adeyemi, to the filing record, to my father directly. I gave him a window, he didn't use it. That's his accounting to make, not mine. There's something my grandmother wrote in that card I still have framed in my house. She didn't say be successful or be impressive. She said don't let them make you small. I think she understood something about integrity that I was still learning at 16. That it's not just about doing the right thing when it's easy. It's about doing it when the cost is real, when the people who should be proud of you are the ones who would prefer you stay quiet. Cassie asked me once, a few months after everything concluded, whether I regretted calling my father that night. Whether I wished I had just let the process unfold without giving him the warning. I thought about it honestly. I said no. Not because the warning changed anything. It didn't. But because I needed to be able to look back and know that I had been the person I was trying to become. Not the person they had always accused me of being. Difficult, dramatic, someone who made things harder than they needed to be. I needed to know I had been the one who showed up. That's the thing nobody tells you about choosing yourself, after years of making yourself smaller for other people. It doesn't feel like liberation at first, it feels like grief. You're grieving the version of your family you needed them to be. You're grieving the years you spent angling for a front row seat in a room that was never really built for you. But on the other side of that grief, if you're willing to sit with it and not run back to the familiar hurt, there's something solid, a sense of your own ground beneath your feet. I tend to garden, I'm still learning. The light comes through the firs in the evenings, and I think about the students who'll receive that scholarship. The ones working double shifts and filling out applications alone, and I think, I know that person. I was that person. And I'm glad I didn't let anyone finish talking me out of her.